25 million years ago, Earth was a very different place. The climate was warmer, and vast forests covered much of the planet. The continents had not yet fully separated, and species roamed freely across what would one day become continents. This was an age of giants and predators, where the flora and fauna were distinct from what we know today. In these lush, tropical forests, a significant evolutionary shift was occurring, one that would pave the way for the emergence of the first humans. At the heart of this great transformation was the appearance of a new class of animals, the great apes. Unlike their ancestors, the early primates who lived in the trees, these new creatures were evolving with abilities that would make them stand apart from every other species. They were our distant relatives, and they were just beginning to embark on the journey that would lead to Homo sapiens, modern humans. The great apes came into existence in a world filled with other primates, lesser cousins who lived alongside them in the dense canopies of trees. Yet the great apes were different. They were more powerful, more intelligent, and more social. The primates of this era were not like the monkeys we see today. They were much larger, with stronger builds and larger brains, which allowed them to think and problem-solve in ways that others could not. One of the first species of great apes to emerge was the Gigantopithecus. Towering over modern-day gorillas, this ape was the largest to ever walk the earth, with estimates suggesting it could grow up to 10 feet tall. It lived in the forests of Asia, living primarily off plants and fruit, although its size likely made it vulnerable to predators, a characteristic that would later shape the survival strategies of its descendants. Alongside Gigantopithecus, other great apes such as the Ramapithecus and Civipithecus also began to spread across the land. These species were not merely surviving, they were thriving in a world filled with competition. These early great apes became known as the Planet of the Apes, where dozens of different species coexisted, each with its unique adaptations to the environment. As these early apes evolved, they began to develop more specialized features. The size and strength of Gigantopithecus allowed it to dominate its environment, but it was its intelligence that would set it apart. Its large brain allowed it to understand its surroundings in new ways, using tools, social structures, and the environment to its advantage. But the path to humanity was not yet clear. There were many species of great apes, each adapting to its environment in different ways. Yet all of them shared one thing in common. They were all on the same trajectory toward becoming something more. The real shift in our evolutionary history occurred with the rise of Australopithecus, a remarkable great ape that lived in the Mediterranean forests, now modern-day Spain 13 million years ago. While Gigantopithecus and other species were large and strong, Australopithecus was different in a way that would lead to a defining feature of humanity: the ability to walk upright. This small but significant change would alter the course of evolution forever. Australopithecus, unlike other apes, developed a unique form of bipedalism that allowed it to walk on 2 feet, at least for short distances. This ability to walk upright was a crucial step toward humanity. While many had believed that bipedalism had evolved as a means of survival on the ground, Australopithecus proved that it was likely first developed in the trees. Its ability to move upright through the branches of trees may have been an adaptation to the environment, a way to reach more food or a strategy to avoid predators. However, it was not just the ability to walk upright that made Australopithecus a key ancestor. It was its social structure and intelligence. This was a species that could cooperate and communicate, and it began to form social groups. These groups were essential for survival, as they allowed the individuals within them to share resources and support each other. This sense of cooperation and empathy would become a defining trait of our species as it evolved. Despite the challenges that came with being a social animal in a competitive environment, Australopithecus thrived. It used its intellect to navigate its environment and adapt to the changing climate. As the forests began to fragment and dry out, the great apes faced new pressures that would force them to evolve quickly. It was during this time that the first signs of human-like behaviour began to emerge. Although they did not yet resemble humans, these early great apes were on the cusp of becoming something new, something that would one day change the world forever. What set Australopithecus apart from its predecessors was not just its ability to walk upright, but its deeper understanding of its surroundings. This early ancestor of humanity was learning how to communicate, how to adapt, and how to survive in a rapidly changing world. The future of the human race rested in the hands of these creatures, who were just beginning to discover the power of cooperation, empathy, and intelligence. And so the journey of humanity began, not with a single individual, but with a family of extraordinary creatures who would change the world forever. As these early great apes roamed the earth, they were preparing to take the first steps toward becoming human. Their story, though ancient, is the beginning of the story of all of us. They were not merely surviving, they were building the foundations of what would become the future of the planet. And in this extraordinary tale of evolution, the story of humanity's beginning was just beginning to unfold. Around 13 million years ago, a new chapter began to unfold in the vast and sprawling forests of the Mediterranean region, in what is now modern-day Spain. The world was different then, far warmer than it is today, with lush, humid tropical forests stretching across large parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Among the many species of primates inhabiting this vibrant ecosystem, there was one that stood apart, Australopithecus. This ape would become one of the most significant milestones in the evolutionary journey of humankind. Australopithecus, with its remarkable adaptations, represents an evolutionary key that would eventually unlock the path toward the first human beings. However, before it could be acknowledged as the first steps toward humanity, it had to showcase a breakthrough that would change the evolutionary trajectory forever: the ability to walk upright. Unlike its primate cousins, Australopithecus did not rely entirely on swinging through the trees. Instead, it spent significant time moving through the trees in a manner that had not been seen in earlier primates. This ape was capable of balancing itself in a way that allowed it to stand on 2 feet, if only for brief moments. This movement wasn't grounded in necessity for life on the forest floor, but rather it stemmed from the unique demands of navigating the tree canopy. Standing up in the trees allowed Australopithecus to reach higher branches, grasp more food, and spot predators or threats with greater accuracy. The evolutionary transition that Australopithecus underwent from the quadrupedal locomotion of most other apes to a more upright posture was revolutionary. Historians and paleontologists have long debated whether walking on 2 feet, also known as bipedalism, began in the trees or on the ground. Australopithecus, however, may offer a crucial piece of the puzzle, evidence that bipedalism was first invented in the treetops. Its ability to remain upright in the trees without relying on the ground suggests that the development of bipedal movement was rooted in the need to interact with its arboreal environment. But there was more to Australopithecus than just its ability to stand. Its acrobatics and agility were extraordinary for a creature of its size. With large hands and feet that could grasp branches with incredible strength, it moved through the canopy like a natural acrobat. This was not only a matter of survival, but also a way to navigate the dense vegetation in search of food, and to evade the larger, more dangerous predators lurking on the forest floor. In fact, many early species of primates were forced to evolve adaptations for tree-dwelling life as a means of protection from the carnivorous beasts that roamed the ground. Australopithecus was no different. As this great ape moved through the trees, its life was shaped by an intricate social structure. Unlike many animals, Australopithecus was not solitary. It was part of a larger group, a social community where cooperation and interaction were essential for survival. This was a key aspect that distinguished the species from other great apes of its time. While other species lived solitary lives or had loose group structures, Australopithecus lived in tight-knit communities. These social structures would lay the groundwork for the more complex societies that would develop in later species, eventually leading to humans. The young male Australopithecus, whom we now know as one of the first individuals of its kind to walk upright, was no stranger to the complex social dynamics of his community. He was part of a social fabric that was already beginning to understand the importance of cooperation. At this stage, the group was not just surviving, but thriving in its environment. The ability to form relationships within the group and share responsibilities was crucial for the survival of the species, and it was this social nature that would ultimately guide the evolution of more advanced hominids and humans. One of the most interesting aspects of Australopithecus's social interactions was the presence of empathy. Modern humans possess the ability to understand the emotions of others and react in ways that promote social cohesion. This skill, which we take for granted today, was not innate in most animals, but early apes like Australopithecus were beginning to exhibit signs of this behavior. Empathy allowed these early creatures to form bonds with others, to care for their young, and to defend each other against predators. An essential part of this empathy was also the development of sympathy. Sympathy goes beyond understanding emotions. It involves feeling the emotions of others. This capacity to share emotional experiences was critical in developing social bonds and, ultimately, social structures. In Australopithecus, the older female, observing the distress of the young male, felt an instinctual urge to protect him, offering an early glimpse of how empathy would evolve in the human lineage. In fact, the young male's attempt to integrate into a new group was a turning point in the history of this species. The community was hesitant to accept him, as they were protective of their territory. Yet, as the young male persisted, offering gifts such as figs and performing acts of grooming, a behavior that is central to primate socialization, he began to earn the trust of the females in the group. The old female, sensing the young male's distress and potential, stepped in to protect him from the more aggressive alpha male, and thus he was adopted into the group. This episode was more than just an example of individual perseverance. It was a demonstration of the power of empathy and social connection. It was the beginning of culture, the idea that knowledge, behaviors, and values could be passed down through generations. The act of grooming and the social importance placed on it were central to the lives of these apes, and over time this behavior would develop into even more complex forms of communication. The relationships and social dynamics of Australopithecus were not limited to social grooming. These early great apes also began to develop a rudimentary understanding of their environment and the food sources available to them. They knew what plants were edible and which ones were poisonous, a knowledge passed down through generations. They also understood the importance of sharing, a behavior that would eventually give rise to the cooperative efforts that characterized human communities. In the realm of survival, the young male's growing knowledge of tools was a significant development. While not yet fully realized, his use of sticks to catch termites was a profound step in the evolution of human tool-making. The tool was more than just a means of catching food, it was an extension of the hand, allowing the ape to interact with its environment in a way that other creatures could not. This tool represented a critical moment in evolutionary history. one that would lead to the complex tool-making abilities of Homo habilis and beyond. For the first time, these apes were using tools to alter their environment to their benefit. This behavior would become one of the defining traits of humanity, the ability to innovate, adapt, and manipulate the world around us. It was the beginning of technology, and it was just the beginning of what was to come. As Australopithecus lived its life in the trees, building nests, forging social bonds, and innovating tools, it unknowingly laid the foundation for the journey of humankind. Its legacy would continue to shape the evolution of its descendants, ultimately giving rise to species that would leave the trees behind, walk on 2 feet, and change the course of history forever. In this world of towering trees and dense jungles, Australopithecus was at the threshold of something revolutionary. And though it may not have fully realized its place in the grand story of life on Earth, its evolutionary innovations would pave the way for the dawn of humanity. Each small step it took, each adaptation, and each social breakthrough brought humanity closer to existence. As the journey of evolution continued through the dense and vibrant forests, Australopithecus and its descendants moved further along the path toward humanity. At the core of this transformation was the development of increasingly complex social bonds driven by empathy and cooperation. These early apes were not just surviving, they were beginning to thrive in social groups, where relationships were defined not only by the need for survival, but by emotional connection and social interaction. Empathy, in its simplest form, is the ability to understand the emotions of others. It is the capacity to feel and recognize what others are going through, and respond in ways that can either soothe or support them. It is often considered one of the key emotional traits that set humans apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. However, research into the behavior of early primates like Australopithecus has revealed that this trait was already developing in our evolutionary ancestors millions of years before humans appeared. The development of empathy among early primates can be traced through their behaviors and interactions within their social groups. Australopithecus, for instance, exhibited signs of empathy as part of its social structure. These early apes did not just live in isolation, they lived in groups, and these groups depended on cooperation to thrive. The ability to connect with others emotionally, whether through physical gestures like grooming or through shared understanding, was fundamental for these groups to function effectively. But empathy goes beyond simply understanding the emotions of others. It involves feeling those emotions as well. This deeper level of emotional connection, called sympathy, would later play a significant role in shaping the societies of our distant ancestors. The first inklings of sympathy can be observed in the way Australopithecus responded to the distress of others within its group. The old female of the group, when witnessing the young male's attempts to integrate into a new social structure, was able to recognize his vulnerability. She was not just aware of his struggle, she felt it. And this emotional response drove her to protect him, ultimately enabling him to join the group. In this way, empathy and sympathy became the bedrock of cooperation within early ape societies. These emotional responses were crucial for building trust, which is essential for any society. Without trust, there can be no cooperation, and without cooperation, survival becomes much more difficult. This is why the development of empathy in Australopithecus was so important. It marked the beginning of a transition from solitary survival to the cooperative social systems that would eventually define human societies. As we delve deeper into the world of early apes, we begin to see the foundations of human society taking shape. These social groups were more than just collections of individuals. They were intricate networks of relationships based on mutual care, shared interests, and, crucially, emotional support. Australopithecus did not merely exist for the sake of survival. It lived in a community where the bonds formed, were as much about emotional connection as they were about necessity. In this environment, the ability to offer and receive care was vital for the well-being of each individual and ultimately the group as a whole. The bonds formed between the members of the group were not purely transactional. They were characterized by emotional intelligence, an awareness of each other's feelings, and a desire to support one another. This emotional connection was especially crucial when it came to child rearing. In the world of Australopithecus, the care for infants and young members of the group went beyond mere physical protection. The females exhibited not just the instinct to protect their young, but also a deep understanding of their needs, emotions, and growth. This empathy toward their offspring ensured the survival and development of the next generation. Interestingly, the development of empathy and social bonds in Australopithecus also helped to foster the evolution of communication. As the young male interacted with the females of the group, his behavior became more complex. He did not rely solely on the instinctive behaviors of his species. He adapted his actions based on his understanding of how others might react. This interaction laid the groundwork for the development of a more sophisticated communication system, one based not just on physical gestures, but on emotional expression and shared understanding. One of the most striking examples of this communication was the way Australopithecus used grooming as a social tool. Grooming, which is often associated with the maintenance of physical well-being, became more than just a hygienic practice. It became an essential part of social interaction, allowing individuals to bond with one another, reinforce social structures, and even communicate emotions. Grooming in Australopithecus was not simply a way to clean each other. It was an act of care and connection, an emotional exchange that reinforced the bond between individuals. This emotional intelligence also extended to conflict resolution. While the group dynamics were not without tension, especially with the dominant male, the presence of empathy allowed for peaceful resolutions. As we saw with the young male, the older female's decision to protect him from the alpha male was a clear indication of how social groups began to value emotional connections over sheer dominance. This early form of conflict resolution through empathy and support foreshadowed the social structures that would later evolve in humans, where power and authority were balanced by the ability to form alliances, build relationships, and communicate effectively. As the group of Australopithecus navigated the challenges of daily life, whether foraging for food, defending against predators, or integrating new members, their ability to empathize with one another and form complex social bonds was integral to their survival. These bonds were the foundation of their social structure, a structure that would continue to evolve as their descendants, like Homo habilis and later Homo sapiens, carried these emotional traits into more complex human societies. In the context of evolutionary history, the social life of Australopithecus represents a turning point. It was the first time that an ape, a distant ancestor of humans, began to live in a world where emotional intelligence and social bonds were as important as physical strength. It marked the beginning of a shift from purely instinctive behavior to a more complex form of cooperation, one based on understanding empathy and shared emotional experiences. The evolution of empathy and social bonds did not just shape the lives of early great apes, it laid the groundwork for the rise of humanity. As these social structures grew more intricate, our ancestors began to develop new ways of living, thinking, and interacting with one another. They began to form communities that were based on trust and mutual care, rather than sheer survival. As we look at the story of Australopithecus, we can see how the early development of empathy and social bonds set the stage for the incredible journey that would lead to the rise of Homo sapiens. These early apes were not just laying the foundation for physical survival, they were laying the foundation for the very essence of what it means to be human. As the evolutionary journey unfolded under the thick canopies of ancient forests, Australopithecus and its descendants faced new challenges in their ever-evolving world. While the development of empathy and social bonds had already begun to shape their interactions, another pivotal breakthrough was on the horizon: the use of tools. It was a shift that would forever change the course of evolution, setting the stage for humanity's dominance on Earth. Long before our species could craft elaborate tools from metals and stone, our ancestors had to start somewhere. The invention of the first tool in the animal kingdom was a small yet profound event, a quiet revolution that would eventually lead to the remarkable technological feats achieved by modern humans. And it was in this world, teeming with life and danger, that Australopithecus would be the first to wield an object that would extend its ability to survive. For much of its existence, Australopithecus had relied on its strength, agility, and intelligence to navigate the dense forests and find food. But survival in a changing world demanded more. As the forests of Europe began to fragment due to climatic shifts, the ancient ape found itself needing new strategies. Foraging for food became more difficult, and the need for a more refined approach to hunting and gathering arose. It was during this period of transition that one young male, an ambitious and resourceful individual, made a discovery that would change everything. This young male, who had already shown a deep understanding of his environment and an ability to connect with others emotionally, was beginning to experiment with his surroundings in a way that no one before him had done. While foraging for food, the young male noticed that the ground below him was full of termites, small delicious insects that had long been a favourite snack of his kind. However, there was a problem. These termites were hidden deep within the soil, and their nests were difficult to access. Other animals too competed for this food source, and the young male's attempts to reach the termites with his hands proved unsuccessful. Frustrated but determined, he began to search for a solution. In his quest to reach the termites, the young male's attention was drawn to a stick lying on the forest floor. It was a simple object, but it had the potential to change everything. The young male picked it up, testing its weight and its ability to reach into the ground. The idea was simple yet ingenious. By using the stick, he could extend his reach and access the termite mounds, tapping into a food source that was otherwise out of his grasp. This was the birth of tool use, the first of many innovations that would propel humanity forward. The stick, an extension of the hand, allowed the young male to interact with his environment in new and exciting ways. This simple tool was not just an object, it was a symbol of ingenuity, of the mind working to solve problems, to overcome obstacles. It was the beginning of human-like innovation, a trait that would be passed down through generations and evolve into the advanced tool-making abilities of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens. The young male's discovery was not an isolated event. Over time, this behaviour spread throughout the group. The Australopithecus community, which had always relied on raw physical strength and social cooperation, now had another layer to their survival strategy: technology. The use of tools would allow them to access new food sources, defend themselves more effectively, and manipulate their environment to meet their needs. As the young male's use of the stick became more refined, the other members of the group began to notice his success. The females, especially, were keen to observe and learn. The ability to share knowledge was a key step in the development of culture, and the young male's invention quickly became a communal activity. The older females, who had already been grooming the young male into their social fabric, were eager to adopt this new behaviour and pass it down to their offspring. This exchange of knowledge, learning from one another, adapting and innovating, was a hallmark of what would eventually become human culture. As the group used the stick more frequently, it became evident that this was not just a practical tool for obtaining food. It was the precursor to a much broader range of tool-making. The minds of these early great apes were opening to new possibilities. The stick was just the beginning. The use of tools had profound implications for the future of these apes. The young male, in his discovery, had opened up a new world of possibilities for his species. The stick became more than just an object for foraging. It represented the dawning of technology. As the group's understanding of tool use grew, they began to experiment with different types of tools, using sticks to dig, to hunt, and to protect themselves from predators. The process of tool-making became more sophisticated, and soon the group's toolset expanded to include sharp-edged stones which could be used to cut food, defend against threats, and even create shelter. What was once a simple tool for gathering termites had evolved into a multi-purpose tool that revolutionized the lives of Australopithecus. The stick and the idea of tools would be passed down through generations, becoming increasingly refined and complex. This would eventually lead to the mastery of fire, the creation of weapons, the development of agriculture, and the myriad innovations that would allow humans to conquer the world. For the young male, this was not just about survival, it was about creation, about thinking beyond the immediate need and imagining new possibilities. In his hands, the stick was a symbol of humanity's ability to adapt, to innovate, and to create. It marked the first step toward the incredible technological advancements that would one day define the human race. This process of learning and adapting would continue as the generations of Australopithecus evolved. Each new tool, each new invention, would bring them closer to what we now recognize as human. The early development of tool use was not just a means of survival. It was a glimpse into the intellectual capabilities of our ancestors, a sign that they were beginning to see the world in new ways, through the lens of creativity and problem-solving. The stick may have been a simple object, but in its use, it sparked a revolution of the mind, of technology, and of the human spirit. As Australopithecus learned to craft and use tools, they were not just changing their environment, they were changing themselves. They were becoming something more than just great apes. They were becoming human. As the evolution of Australopithecus continued, a significant shift was taking place within the group's social fabric. The invention of tools had opened up new avenues for survival and cooperation, but it was not just physical tools that would ensure the group's success. Alongside the creation of tools came the ability to share knowledge and adapt collectively to the challenges of an ever-changing environment. This knowledge was passed down not just through actions, but through teaching, learning, and communication. The sharing of information, particularly regarding the environment and survival strategies, became the foundation of a culture that was forming, one that would later give rise to the human capacity for learning, passing on traditions, and building communities. One of the most important forms of knowledge that began to develop was the understanding of healing. In a world where survival often depended on the ability to recognize and remedy injuries or illnesses, the early great apes of the Australopithecus group began to show remarkable intelligence in their understanding of medicinal plants and healing practices. This knowledge would evolve into something far more sophisticated over time, but its earliest seeds can be traced back to the actions of these early primates. The discovery of healing plants was not a random accident, but rather the result of observation, trial and error, and the sharing of knowledge within the group. The mothering females in particular played a key role in teaching their offspring what was edible, what could cure ailments, and how to use their environment to protect themselves. Australopithecus mothers and elder females were not just caregivers, they were also teachers. They demonstrated to the younger members of the group how to interact with the environment, pointing out the plants that could be eaten as well as those that could be harmful. They passed on a deep understanding of the natural world and how to harness its power for survival. The young male, who had shown great ingenuity in the discovery of the stick as a tool for gathering termites, was also beginning to grasp this new form of knowledge. As he ventured further into the forest, he observed the medicinal plants used by other animals and began experimenting with them. His keen sense of observation, combined with the knowledge passed down from the older females, allowed him to make important discoveries. One of the most remarkable was his ability to identify plants that could be used to treat illnesses or injuries. When one of the young females in the group fell ill, the young male remembered a particular plant that his mother had once shown him. This plant, when crushed and applied to wounds, seemed to alleviate pain and promote healing. The young male used this knowledge to help the ailing female. It was a significant moment in the development of early human-like behaviour. Healing was no longer just a matter of physical care. It was a practice rooted in knowledge, learned behaviours, and the collective wisdom of the group. The young male's actions demonstrated the emergence of not only individual problem-solving, but also the beginning of cultural transmission. Knowledge was now being passed down from one generation to the next, and with it came a sense of responsibility, an understanding that the survival of the group depended on the exchange of critical information. This development laid the foundation for more sophisticated healthcare practices that would follow. As time progressed, the group began to recognize the importance of maintaining the health of every member. The females, who already took on the roles of nurturers, began to incorporate healing into their caregiving. The young male's experimentation with medicinal plants and his ability to recognize the importance of shared knowledge would play a critical role in the survival of the species. At this early stage, knowledge sharing went beyond healthcare. It was seen in the way tools were made and passed down through the group. For instance, when the young male first used the stick to gather termites, he did not keep the knowledge to himself. He shared his discovery with others. Through trial and error, the group learned to modify the tool to serve other purposes, such as digging for roots or defending against predators. This practice of sharing knowledge within the group further strengthened the social fabric, ensuring that the survival of the species was a collective effort. Every member had a role to play, and the more the group communicated and shared their findings, the more efficient they became at navigating the complexities of their environment. Moreover, Australopithecus also displayed a growing understanding of resource management. They began to recognize that food and resources were not unlimited, and that they needed to work together to gather and distribute them efficiently. This included sharing food, with the young male offering the older female figs and termites, and learning about which foods could be harvested and stored for later use. This behaviour was not only a survival tactic, but also a demonstration of how resource management and sharing were becoming integral parts of their social structure. What made the early humans of Australopithecus stand apart from other animals was their growing capacity for cooperation. In times of danger, the group would come together to defend against threats, such as large predators or rival groups. The strength of the group lay in its ability to act as a unit, and cooperation was key to this survival strategy. It wasn't just about physical strength or sheer numbers. It was about pooling knowledge, resources, and skills to create a unified effort. This understanding of cooperation would eventually evolve into more complex social systems, but the foundations were already being laid. As the group continued to evolve, they encountered new challenges that demanded even more sophisticated responses. The climate continued to shift, and the lush forest that had once provided ample food and shelter began to change. Some areas grew drier, and others became less hospitable. But the group's ability to adapt to these environmental shifts, using the knowledge they had accumulated about tools, healing, and food sources, allowed them to survive. Their social bonds and communication were no longer just a matter of emotional connection, they were a matter of survival. The Australopithecus group's ability to share knowledge, especially regarding healing, marked an important milestone in the evolution of humanity. It wasn't just the physical tools that enabled survival, it was the ability to communicate, to teach, and to adapt based on knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. This sharing of knowledge ensured that future generations would not have to start from scratch. It was a crucial step in the development of culture and society, a step that would eventually lead to the incredibly sophisticated systems of education, health, and cooperation that characterize modern human societies today. Thus, the path from Australopithecus to modern humans was paved not just by physical traits or technological innovations, but by an evolving understanding of knowledge sharing. Through the lens of healing, cooperation, and communication, these early apes began to craft the essential building blocks of culture, one of the most important aspects of what would ultimately distinguish humans from the rest of the animal kingdom. The world was changing. The once lush forests that provided a safe haven for Australopithecus were beginning to shift under the weight of climatic transformations. The warming that had allowed tropical rainforests to thrive was now giving way to cooler, drier conditions that began to reshape the environment and force new adaptations. For the early great apes, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. The survival of these creatures, which were increasingly becoming more like humans, depended not just on their ability to cope with the physical changes around them, but on how they could adapt their behaviors, social structures, and strategies for survival. As the climate began to cool, forests began to shrink and fragment. The once dense canopies were replaced by patches of open grassland, savannas, and shrinking forested areas. This shift in the landscape brought about new challenges. The forests, which had long provided shelter, food, and security, began to disappear. The animals that once thrived in the dense foliage now had to deal with an increasingly fragmented world. The great apes were no longer able to move freely through vast tracts of continuous forest. Instead, they found themselves on the edge of a dramatic transformation, one that would ultimately push their evolutionary journey in a new direction. For the group of Australopithecus, this new reality forced a profound adaptation. They were no longer merely inhabitants of the trees. As the forests fragmented and shrank, bipedalism, the ability to walk upright, became even more critical. The forests were being replaced by open savannas, where the cover of trees was far less reliable as protection from predators. The transition from the dense safety of the forest canopy to more exposed landscapes required new strategies. Bipedalism, which had initially evolved to help these great apes navigate the branches of trees, now gave them a new advantage on the ground. Walking on 2 feet allowed them to see farther and scan the horizon for dangers, such as large predators. They were able to travel longer distances to find food, water, and shelter in an environment that had become more dispersed. More than that, walking on 2 feet freed up their hands, which allowed them to carry food, tools, or even their offspring over long distances. This new ability gave them a much wider range of options as they adapted to the changing landscape. While bipedalism was an essential adaptation for surviving the shifting terrain, it was not enough on its own. The climate change meant that food sources were becoming increasingly difficult to find. The lush fruit-bearing trees that once dominated the landscape were being replaced by harsher, more arid conditions. Australopithecus, which had primarily relied on fruit, now needed to learn how to explore new food sources to meet their growing needs. The group's social behavior began to evolve as well. In the fragmented environment, the cooperative nature of their society became an even more critical survival strategy. The sharing of resources, whether it was food, shelter, or information, ensured that each individual played a part in the group's survival. The females in particular began to take on more prominent roles in gathering food. Their deep understanding of the land and their strong ability to innovate became invaluable to the group. They knew where to find the remaining food sources, and they passed this knowledge on to their young, ensuring that the next generation would have the tools to survive in this rapidly changing world. As the environment continued to evolve, Australopithecus began to experiment with new behaviours. They started to explore new foraging techniques, such as digging for roots and tubers, which had not been part of their diet before. The use of tools, first demonstrated with the stick to gather termites, now became an even more important skill. The early tools were being adapted for new uses. The group began using sticks, rocks, and stones to break open tough plant materials and to dig into the soil for underground foods. What had once been a simple tool for termite collection was now being employed in a variety of ways. In some ways, the environmental changes were a catalyst for a new era of innovation. With food sources growing scarcer and the need to adapt more pressing, Australopithecus showed a remarkable ability to experiment. The very act of searching for new food sources, whether digging for roots or cracking open seeds, necessitated new tools. Over time, these tools became increasingly sophisticated. What began with the humble stick to harvest termites was slowly evolving into a wider array of implements designed to break, dig, and manipulate the environment. The bipedalism that had started in the trees now proved essential for foraging and exploring. With their hands free, the early apes could carry items and tools. The increased reliance on the tools, paired with the ability to walk longer distances, enabled Australopithecus to survive in areas where food was not as easily accessible. This marked a significant step in their evolutionary journey. These early great apes were beginning to adapt not only by physically evolving, but also by using their ingenuity to change their relationship with the environment. As the climate continued to shift, the forests began to break apart completely, leaving behind isolated patches of vegetation. The group was now faced with a world that was both unfamiliar and increasingly difficult to navigate. The need for adaptation was greater than ever. The group began to rely more heavily on their innovative behaviours and tool use to thrive in this harsh new landscape. The tools that had once served them in gathering food were now being employed for new purposes, including defence and shelter. As Australopithecus ventured further from the forest and deeper into more exposed areas, the predators that had once roamed the ground became an increasing threat. The group began to encounter new dangers, larger, more dangerous carnivores that could easily overpower them. To deal with these predators, the group not only relied on their physical strength and agility, but also on their newfound intelligence and cooperation. The ability to work together to fend off threats became another defining trait of this group. Through a mixture of social cooperation, tool use, and ingenuity, Australopithecus was able to thrive in a world that was growing increasingly hostile. In the broader context of evolution, the climate change that affected Australopithecus set the stage for even greater adaptations. The fragmented forests and increasing savannas were a sign that the great apes were entering a new phase of evolution. The adaptations that were developing during this period, such as bipedalism, tool use, and social cooperation, would form the basis for the future of our species. The intelligence and social bonds that began to emerge in Australopithecus would be further refined in later species, eventually leading to the rise of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and, eventually, Homo sapiens. As Australopithecus learned to adapt to the changing environment, using tools, cooperating in groups, and utilizing the resources around them, they were not only surviving the harsh conditions of their time, they were laying the groundwork for the evolution of humanity. The challenges of climate change had forced these great apes to think differently, to innovate, and to adapt. This marked the beginning of the human journey toward not only survival but the ability to shape the world around them. Around 7 million years ago, a new chapter in the evolutionary saga of humankind began to take shape. The great forests that once dominated much of the Earth were continuing to retreat, and the climate was shifting again. As the world's ecosystems transformed, so too did the creatures that inhabited them. Sahelanthropus, also known as Tume, emerged as a crucial link in the chain of evolution. This species of early hominid marked a significant step away from the lifestyle of Australopithecus and toward a more defined path leading to the rise of modern humans. Sahelanthropus lived in a world that was vastly different from the one its ancestors had known. The dense tropical forests were becoming scarcer, and much of the Earth's surface was being reshaped by increasingly drier and more unpredictable conditions. The lush greenery was being replaced by a patchwork of savannas, grasslands, and smaller pockets of forest. These changes were both a threat and an opportunity for the creatures that lived in these regions. The birth of Sahelanthropus was not only a response to the changing environment, but also a defining moment in the journey of human evolution. Sahelanthropus stood apart from its predecessors like Australopithecus in many ways, though it still retained many of the characteristics of the earlier great apes. The most defining feature of Sahelanthropus, however, was its bipedalism. While Australopithecus had walked upright in the trees, Sahelanthropus took that a step further by walking more efficiently on the ground, adapting to the new, more exposed savanna environment. This marked a key transition in the evolution of early hominids, as they began to spend more time on the ground rather than in the trees. One of the most significant aspects of Sahelanthropus's evolutionary development was the shape of its skull. The position of the foramen magnum, the hole in the skull where the spinal cord connects to the brain, suggested that Sahelanthropus's head was positioned more vertically than that of earlier primates. This is a clear sign of an adaptation to bipedalism, an ability to walk upright more efficiently on the ground. This physical change was more than just a shift in posture. It was a sign of the fundamental changes that were occurring within the hominid family, signalling that these creatures were on their way to becoming something distinctly different from their ape ancestors. Despite these early advancements, Sahelanthropus was not yet fully human. It still retained many traits that were similar to those of the great apes, particularly in the structure of its face and teeth. However, it was the first of its kind to clearly exhibit traits of early humanity, including more refined bipedalism, and this set it on a distinct evolutionary path. This early hominid lived on the edges of forests and open savannas, in an environment that encouraged its development into a more grounded species. The ability to walk upright gave it a new perspective on the world, quite literally. By standing tall, Sahelanthropus could see over tall grasses, spot predators, and search for food in a much larger area. But the physical adaptation of bipedalism was only part of the story. Sahelanthropus also marked an important milestone in social behaviour. The group structure of Sahelanthropus was likely similar to that of its predecessors, such as Australopithecus, where individuals lived in social groups for mutual support, cooperation, and protection. However, the challenges of living in a more open and exposed environment pushed these early hominids to innovate socially as well as physically. Cooperation was essential for survival, especially as predators became more numerous and the environment more unpredictable. What made Sahelanthropus particularly interesting was its ability to adapt not only to its changing physical environment but to its social environment as well. It was no longer just a matter of surviving as an individual or a small group. In this increasingly harsh world, survival meant adapting to the dynamics of the larger group, learning how to cooperate, share resources, and build alliances. The formation of social bonds in early hominids like Sahelanthropus would be vital for survival and in many ways was the precursor to the highly structured societies that would later emerge in the Homo sapiens lineage. Sahelanthropus lived in a time of great upheaval. The environment was changing rapidly, and with these changes came new challenges. The once abundant forests were disappearing, and the wide open plains and savannas were becoming more prominent. This shift forced the early hominids to adapt in ways that would have been unimaginable to their ape ancestors. The development of bipedalism was just one of many adaptations that helped Sahelanthropus navigate this new world. One of the key elements of survival in this changing environment was foraging for food. Sahelanthropus's diet likely consisted of a combination of fruit, leaves, seeds, and other plant material, though they may have also eaten insects and small animals. The fact that this early hominid was able to move effectively on the ground meant it could travel further in search of food, reducing the need for constant access to the trees. As a result, Sahelanthropus became more adaptable to a wider range of environments, from the savannas to the edges of the forest, and this adaptability would be crucial in the years to come. Despite these physical and behavioural changes, Sahelanthropus still had a long way to go before it would fully transition into the human-like creatures that would eventually dominate the planet. The brain of Sahelanthropus was still relatively small compared to modern humans, and its tool use was likely rudimentary at best. However, the small shifts in social structure, behaviour and physical adaptation were the first steps in a journey that would lead to the emergence of the Homo genus, and ultimately to the birth of Homo sapiens. In the grand tapestry of human evolution, Sahelanthropus represents an important intersection, the point where the great apes began to diverge from the human lineage. It was neither fully ape nor fully human, but instead it was an intermediary, a bridge between the past and the future of humanity. Its development of bipedalism, along with its evolving social behaviours, were critical in setting the stage for later hominids to further refine these characteristics. Toumai, as Sahelanthropus is sometimes called, is an early sign of the possibilities that lay ahead. The descendants of Sahelanthropus would soon evolve into species that would master new technologies, develop complex societies, and begin to alter their environment in ways that would leave a permanent mark on the planet. But for now, Toumai and its contemporaries lived in a world that was in the midst of change. The era of the great apes was coming to an end, and a new chapter was beginning, one that would eventually lead to the rise of humans. In this way, Sahelanthropus represents more than just a species in the evolutionary timeline. It symbolises the potential within all species to adapt, change and survive in an ever-shifting world. The story of Toumai is a testament to the resilience of life and to the unexpected paths evolution can take to create something truly remarkable: humanity. The birth of Sahelanthropus was a pivotal moment in the history of human evolution. Yet even as this new species began to take its first steps on the ground, the development of bipedalism, the ability to walk upright on 2 feet, was already well underway. This characteristic, which would eventually become one of the defining features of humanity, was not an invention of any single species or moment in time. Instead, it was the result of millions of years of gradual adaptation and change that would mark the separation between humans and their closest primate relatives. Bipedalism is often considered the key evolutionary trait that set our ancestors apart from other animals. It marks the point in evolutionary history where our ancestors began to adapt to the environmental pressures of the savanna and other open landscapes. Walking on 2 feet instead of 4 opened up new possibilities for survival, such as the ability to see over tall grass, travel long distances, and use the hands for tasks other than locomotion, such as tool making and carrying food. The origins of bipedalism can be traced back to our early ancestors, Long before the emergence of Homo sapiens, species like Sahelanthropus were already demonstrating early signs of bipedal behaviour, but it was in the later evolution of hominids, such as Australopithecus and Homo habilis, that this trait became more refined and consistent. The first indications of bipedalism appeared in species like Sahelanthropus and its direct descendants. While this early hominid still retained features adapted for life in the trees, the position of its foramen magnum, the hole in the skull where the spinal cord connects to the brain, suggested that it was walking on 2 feet more than its predecessors. Unlike the great apes, which had a more horizontal spine, Sahelanthropus exhibited an upright posture, suggesting it could walk on 2 legs. However, Sahelanthropus was not fully bipedal in the way that later species would be. Its bipedalism was still rudimentary, and much of its time was likely spent in the trees, where it could take advantage of its arboreal adaptations. The fully upright walking that we associate with humans would not fully develop until later, but this early shift toward bipedalism was the starting point for what would become one of the most defining features of our lineage. As Sahelanthropus began to adapt to the changing environment, walking on 2 feet provided a number of key advantages. One of the most obvious was the ability to see over tall grasses and spot predators from a distance. In the open savannas and forest edges where early hominids lived, being able to stand upright and look around gave them an important survival advantage. They could spot threats, like large predators, before they were too close, giving them more time to react and evade danger. Another important benefit of bipedalism was the ability to cover greater distances. As the environment shifted, food sources became more spread out, and water sources were increasingly scarce. Walking on 2 feet allowed hominids to travel longer distances more efficiently, covering large areas in search of food and shelter. Unlike quadrupedal animals, which expend significant energy moving on all 4s, bipedal creatures conserve energy by walking upright. This energy efficiency would become even more important as hominids began to venture farther from their original habitats and adapt to a variety of environments. In addition to these survival advantages, bipedalism also freed the hands for other tasks. Once upright, the hands were no longer required for movement, which allowed early hominids to use tools and manipulate objects in new ways. The ability to carry food, tools, and even young offspring while travelling was a major advantage. Tool use, which began with simple objects like sticks and stones, would eventually become one of the most important aspects of human evolution. The hands became essential for shaping and using tools, crafting weapons, and even building shelter. Furthermore, the ability to walk upright allowed for more efficient thermoregulation. In the open savanna, exposure to the sun could become a significant challenge. Standing upright minimized the amount of body surface area exposed to direct sunlight and allowed early hominids to regulate their body temperature more effectively. This ability to cope with heat was critical for survival in the increasingly hot and arid environments that would become the norm in Africa and beyond. While Sahelanthropus exhibited some early signs of bipedalism, it was in the later species of Australopithecus that bipedalism became fully established. The famous example of Australopithecus afarensis, known through the remains of the fossilized skeleton of Lucy, provides clear evidence that these early hominids were walking on 2 legs with remarkable efficiency. The structure of their pelvis, spine, and leg bones indicated a fully bipedal gait, which allowed them to travel great distances and cover more ground than their quadrupedal relatives. Unlike their predecessors, Australopithecus species spent most, if not all, of their time on the ground, although they may have still used trees for shelter or occasional foraging. These early hominids had adapted to life on the open savannas, using their newfound ability to walk upright to hunt, gather, and avoid predators. Bipedalism had become a cornerstone of their lifestyle, offering them advantages in terms of survival, social organisation, and access to resources. With the emergence of Homo habilis, the first members of the Homo genus, bipedalism took on new dimensions. Homo habilis was the first species to consistently use stone tools, and its bipedalism was not just a passive adaptation, it was now an active component of the species' survival strategy. The ability to move efficiently on 2 feet allowed Homo habilis to access food sources and use tools in ways that earlier hominids could not. As a result, Homo habilis is often referred to as the first true tool user, laying the foundation for future advancements in technology and culture. The final stay in the evolution of bipedalism came with the advent of Homo erectus, a species that demonstrated an even more refined form of walking upright. Unlike earlier hominids, Homo erectus had a body adapted for long-distance running and walking, with longer legs, shorter arms, and an expanded brain. This species was able to navigate vast distances across Africa and eventually beyond as it spread into Europe and Asia. The physical traits of Homo erectus, such as its larger brain and more sophisticated tools, were key factors in its survival and eventual dominance over other species. However, the development of efficient bipedalism, which allowed for travel and tool use, was an essential factor that contributed to the success of this species. Homo erectus was the first hominid capable of sustained long-distance walking and running, which played a vital role in its ability to hunt large game and adapt to new environments. The evolutionary journey from Sahelanthropus to Homo erectus marks a significant milestone in the development of humanity. Bipedalism was the gateway to the many adaptations that would later define Homo sapiens, such as tool use, social cooperation, and cognitive complexity. The development of efficient bipedal locomotion allowed early hominids to adapt to changing environments, compete with predators, and explore new territories. It laid the groundwork for the human traits of intelligence, innovation, and adaptability. In many ways, bipedalism was not just a physical adaptation. It was a defining feature of the human journey. It allowed for greater freedom, more complex social structures, and the ability to manipulate the environment in ways that no other species had done before. It opened the door to tool use, language, and culture. As such, it is the cornerstone of what makes us human. As the early human ancestors ventured through the evolving landscapes of Africa, navigating between dense forests and open savannas, they encountered a world full of challenges and predators. For these hominids, survival required constant adaptation, physically, socially, and intellectually. However, as their social structures and intelligence grew more complex, a new and unexpected development emerged. The invention of war, a practice that would define much of human history, took root in the earliest of our ancestors, marking a dark turning point in evolution. In this stage of evolution, the species had already adapted to living in social groups and cooperating with one another. They relied on tools, bipedalism, and social cooperation for survival. But what set them apart from other animals was their ability to use violence, not just for survival, but for conquest. The advent of war was not simply about defending against predators or rival groups. It was the first emergence of organized intergroup conflict, driven by the need for resources, territory, and even mate selection. The first hominids, such as Sahelanthropus and its descendants, were already experiencing the pressures of their environment. However, a fundamental shift began to take place with the rise of a more evolved species. Tumai, the early Sahelanthropus. These early hominids lived in groups where males competed for dominance and females, while the collective cohesion of the group provided some defense against external threats. They were not immune to internal conflicts. The first signs of warfare began to emerge as the territorial needs of these groups started to overlap. They needed more space, more food, and more control over resources. But it was not just about surviving. It was about exerting power over others, asserting dominance and controlling key areas. The invention of war is often linked to the need for dominance. As early hominids began to form larger and more organized groups, their social structures became increasingly hierarchical. The males, particularly the dominant alphas, started to assert control over the group's resources and reproductive opportunities. The females, although influential in their own right, began to serve the needs of the male-dominated structure, leading to new challenges within the group. It was during this time that the alpha male became a symbol of power. The alpha was the leader who controlled the group's resources, such as food and females, and in the case of the early Sahelanthropus and tamed, he also controlled access to the territory. However, as resources became scarcer and competition for dominance grew fiercer, the power of the alpha male started to be challenged by others in the group. This led to an escalation of conflict between individuals. The first hints of warfare came in the form of intergroup aggression. While earlier hominids may have engaged in occasional fights or skirmishes for food or mates, the escalation of these conflicts into organized raids for territory and resources mark the true beginnings of war. A new dynamic emerged, one in which males competed not only for dominance within the group, but for control of the group itself. As the early humans began to realize that they could manipulate their environment, their weapons evolved. Initially, tools like sticks and stones were used for gathering food or defending against predators. But as the social dynamics of early hominid groups began to change, these tools were repurposed for new uses, specifically as weapons for violence. The first true weapons were likely simple objects, like rocks or sharpened sticks, but over time these tools became more sophisticated. One of the first true instances of war occurred when a dominant alpha male saw his position threatened by another male. It is believed that these early hominid groups, driven by both survival instincts and the newly developing concept of territoriality, began to engage in organized conflict with neighboring groups. This marked the beginning of warfare, as groups began to fight for territory, food, and mates. The first battle likely took place in a moment of extreme tension between two competing groups of early hominids. One group, led by a dominant alpha male, controlled a rich food source and a prime piece of territory. However, as the rival group began to threaten their resources, a battle for dominance ensued. These early hominids, although not equipped with sophisticated weapons or strategies, engaged in combat, using stones, clubs, and their physical strength to try to overpower each other. At the heart of this battle was territoriality. These hominid groups recognized the value of the land they lived on, not just as a habitat, but as a resource-rich area that provided them with food, shelter, and security. As the competition for these resources grew fiercer, the conflict between groups intensified. War was no longer just a matter of defending against predators or rivals. It became a means of asserting control, and in doing so, gaining access to the resources that were necessary for survival. The emergence of warfare marked a shift in the social structure of early hominid societies. The concept of power dynamics, which had once been primarily about internal group hierarchy, was now being influenced by the external conflicts. As the hominid groups grew larger and more complex, their societies began to organize around the need for protection, and this required a level of strategy and cooperation that had not been necessary before. As the early human ancestors engaged in warfare, they began to develop strategies and alliances that would later characterize human warfare. The early conflicts likely involved raids on enemy territories or preemptive strikes to gain control of key resources. In some cases, the fighting may have been over food, shelter, or access to mates. But as these groups began to organize themselves more effectively, the nature of war evolved. The alpha males, once the sole leaders of their groups, now found themselves navigating a more complex and dynamic world. Alliances began to form between different groups, creating coalitions that could unite against a common enemy. This ability to forge alliances for mutual benefit would later evolve into the political and military structures that defined human warfare throughout history. The act of war was no longer simply about personal dominance. It was about group survival and the ability to maintain control over valuable resources. Over time, warfare would become more organized, as early humans began to use tactics and tools to their advantage. The development of more effective weapons, such as sharpened stones, spears, and other tools, enabled early hominids to engage in more efficient and deadly combat. As these weapons became more sophisticated, the nature of war changed. It was no longer just about brute strength and dominance. It was about strategy, coordination, and the use of resources to achieve victory. The first invention of war laid the groundwork for much of human history. While early conflicts were likely small-scale battles between neighbouring groups, these skirmishes set the stage for the larger, more organised wars that would follow. The rise of powerful alpha males, territoriality, and group cooperation would eventually give way to complex societies where war was no longer just about survival, but about political, economic, and social control. The invention of war in the early hominids reflects a fundamental shift in the way humans would interact with each other and with the environment. It was the start of a long and bloody history of human conflict, one that would shape the course of civilization for millennia. Warfare, initially driven by basic survival instincts, evolved into a tool for conquest, expansion, and domination, a theme that would persist through the rise of ancient kingdoms, empires, and nations. Thus, the invention of war marked a turning point in the history of humanity. It was a manifestation of the growing complexity of human society, where cooperation and conflict could both be used to shape the future. In the early hominid struggle for dominance, we see the roots of human aggression, the emergence of power structures, and the beginnings of the social organization that would eventually lead to the modern world. For millions of years, the early hominids lived in a world defined by survival, where each day brought new challenges from predators to the search for food and shelter. But as the evolving species like Sahelanthropus, Australopithecus, and Homo habilis began to develop more complex social structures and intelligence, they were confronted with a reality that had eluded their ancestors: the concept of death. Unlike the simple survival struggles that defined early life, the awareness of death would become one of the most profound and transformative elements in the journey from early hominids to modern humanity. The first encounter with death in our evolutionary lineage did not occur as a single, isolated event. Rather, it unfolded gradually, with the first hominids beginning to understand that their world was fragile and that life was not a given. Early species were aware of the physical dangers of their environment, predators, food shortages, and the elements, but they likely did not yet comprehend that life was finite, and that death could strike not just from external threats, but from natural causes, illness, and injury. It is believed that the first hominids, such as Sahelanthropus and Australopithecus, were not yet fully aware of the concept of death. They likely lived in a world where the experience of death was tied primarily to the loss of individuals, whether it was through the attacks of predators, injuries, or other natural causes. But what separated these early hominids from other animals was their growing social complexity. As Sahelanthropus began to walk upright and live in larger social groups, the death of one member had a profound impact on the entire group. Unlike solitary animals that could easily replace a fallen member, these early hominids had become interdependent. Loss, the absence of a group member, was deeply felt by the community. The first encounter with death likely came in the form of a group member dying, perhaps from an accident, injury, or illness. Early hominids like Australopithecus afarensis or Homo habilis would have experienced the physical absence of a member, but they were also capable of grief. They would have witnessed the death of a young or old member of the group and likely tried to protect or care for that individual in their final moments. This form of empathy and emotional response marked the beginning of a mourning, an emotional bond tied to loss. For these early hominids, the death of a group member did not just mean the loss of a companion or friend, it signified a deeper emotional and psychological impact on the entire community. Over time, this sense of loss would evolve into a more profound understanding of death itself. These early hominids would have observed that death was not just a random event, it was a reality of life. The group may have experienced this loss in different ways. Some would have simply moved on, while others, especially females and younger members, may have shown signs of mourning, keeping the deceased member's body close or attempting to care for the body. This mourning behaviour would eventually evolve into rituals, a way for early humans to acknowledge death and cope with the emotional pain. Though we can only hypothesize about the nature of these early mourning practices, evidence from later hominids suggests that the roots of burial practices and ceremonial rituals were already emerging at this stage. It is likely that early hominids began to gather the remains of the deceased and place them in a special place, perhaps covering them with branches or leaves, indicating that they understood the finality of death and sought to honour or protect the remains in some way. As bipedal hominids evolved and began to develop more advanced cognitive abilities, the idea of death became more complex. These early humans were beginning to question the nature of life and death. While we cannot know for certain when early hominids first began to understand that death was permanent, it is likely that Homo erectus, who lived around 1.8 million years ago, was among the first to develop a more concrete sense of the soul or an afterlife. The concept of an afterlife would have provided comfort in the face of the inevitable, helping the group make sense of the loss and the absence of a loved one. Homo erectus, with its larger brain, more complex social structures, and ability to create tools, would have been capable of deeper introspection and reflection on the nature of existence. The development of early language would have allowed for the expression of these complex ideas about death, the soul, and the afterlife. The first evidence of intentional burials, such as those found in Homo erectus sites, suggests that this species had begun to perform rituals and ceremonies around death. While the exact nature of these early rituals is unclear, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that suggests early humans began to bury their dead with tools, food, or other objects. These burials likely held symbolic significance, offering a glimpse into the early human effort to understand the transition from life to death. The burial sites of Homo erectus and later Neanderthals suggest that the deceased were not merely discarded, but were instead treated with respect, possibly as a way of ensuring a peaceful transition to the afterlife. The awareness of death marked a profound shift in the human experience. As Homo sapiens evolved, they began to develop more complex and meaningful rituals around death, ones that provided a way to cope with loss, express grief, and honour the dead. Early humans would have created ceremonies to mark the death of a loved one, celebrating their life and acknowledging their impact on the group. These rituals were essential for the psychological health of the group, as they allowed for the expression of grief and the transition into a new social order without the deceased. Rituals around death eventually led to the creation of more structured belief systems. As humans began to develop more complex tools and strategies for survival, they also began to develop ideas about spirituality and the afterlife. Over time, these early beliefs would evolve into more structured religions and philosophies, each offering explanations about life after death, the soul, and the eternal nature of existence. The awareness of death also had profound implications for social organization. The way a group responded to the death of a member, whether through rituals, mourning, or even the creation of memorials, contributed to the cohesion and unity of the group. Early humans needed these emotional connections not only for their mental well-being, but for the survival of the group. Death was no longer simply an end, but a transition that carried emotional and social consequences. As humans began to understand the inevitability of death, they also started to recognize their legacy. The deceased left behind not just physical remains, but also memories, teachings, and wisdom. This understanding of the legacy left by the deceased helped shape the way early humans viewed their place in the world. It is likely that early humans began to leave marks on the world, whether through cave paintings, tools, or oral traditions, as a way of leaving something behind for future generations. The legacy of the dead became a powerful motivation for human progress. Death, while still a source of fear and sadness, became a central part of the human experience, influencing everything from social relationships to spirituality. It was through their awareness of death that early humans began to build the cultural, social, and spiritual systems that would shape human civilization. The awareness of death, which began with the early hominids and continued through to Homo sapiens, ultimately helped define what it means to be human. In coping with the loss of loved ones, humans developed social bonds and rituals that strengthened group cohesion. As humans confronted the finality of death, they also began to question their existence, which led to the development of more complex belief systems, cultures, and societies. Death was not just the end of an individual's life, it was the beginning of a cultural evolution that would shape the trajectory of human history. From the simple rituals of early hominids to the complex burial practices of Homo sapiens, death helped define humanity's understanding of life, the soul, and the afterlife. And in those early moments of grief and mourning, humanity took its first steps toward becoming a species capable of profound reflection, empathy, and social cooperation. As humanity's early ancestors emerged from the shadows of the great apes, they began to face increasingly severe environmental challenges. These challenges would play a crucial role in shaping the physical and social development of early hominids. From the drying landscapes of Africa to the expanding deserts and shrinking forests, the world was changing, and so too were the species that inhabited it. The world that early hominids lived in was nothing like the stable, predictable environments that we are used to today. With climatic shifts occurring rapidly, these early humans were pushed to their limits as they tried to adapt to increasingly harsh conditions. The challenges of survival were not just about dealing with predators or the search for food and water. They were about adapting to environments that demanded new ways of thinking, living, and interacting with the world around them. The struggle for survival was about to take on a whole new dimension. The world of early hominids was rapidly transforming. Once lush forests, where early apes had spent most of their time, began to shrink due to a cooling climate and changing precipitation patterns. Vast regions of Africa that had once been home to dense tropical forests were gradually replaced by more open savannas and grasslands. These changes forced the early hominids to venture out of the protective cover of the trees and into new exposed environments. For early species like Australopithecus, the challenge was no longer just surviving in the trees, but adapting to the open landscapes where dangers were far more prevalent. This shift also brought with it new forms of competition. Early hominids began to face challenges not only from other species, but also from new and more dangerous predators. As the savannas expanded and the forests receded, new predators adapted to the open terrain, such as big cats and hyenas, which posed an immediate threat to these early species. Unlike the previous generation of great apes, which lived primarily in the trees where they could escape danger, these new predators were formidable and relentless. In these harsh environments, early hominids faced a choice: continue relying on the old ways of living in the trees, or adapt to a more open, exposed world. The answer was clear: adaptation was the key to survival. In response to the changing environment, early hominids began to exhibit behaviours that would eventually make them more adaptable to these new conditions. Bipedalism, already a significant evolutionary advantage, became even more crucial as early humans transitioned from life in the trees to life on the ground. Walking on 2 feet gave them the ability to see over tall grasses, spot predators, and travel across the open savannas in search of food and shelter. But it wasn't just physical traits that contributed to their survival. The ability to work together as a group and to communicate and share information became critical in navigating the complexities of their environment. Social cooperation, which had already begun to take shape in earlier species, was now a vital strategy for survival. The group no longer relied solely on the strength of individual members, but on the combined efforts of the entire group. Early hominids, like Homo habilis and Australopithecus, developed increasingly sophisticated ways of gathering and sharing resources. Food was no longer just a matter of picking fruit from trees. As the climate shifted, early humans began to seek out new food sources, such as roots, tubers, and small animals, adapting their diets to the changing landscape. They began using tools, initially simple rocks or sticks, to dig for food, crack open nuts, and defend themselves against predators. This marked a significant shift in the human story. The first tools, which were likely used for survival, were the foundation for all subsequent technological advancements. Early humans used tools to help them find food, but these tools would soon evolve into weapons that allowed early humans to defend themselves more effectively. The use of fire was another major step forward, providing warmth, protection from predators, and a new way of cooking food. As the world became more dangerous, cooperation within groups became even more important. Early hominids lived in tight-knit social groups where cooperation was essential for survival. These groups were likely composed of family members, with the division of labour and a hierarchy where females gathered food, males hunted, and the elderly and young were cared for by the rest of the group. But survival was not just about sharing resources, it was also about cooperation in defence against external threats. Early human ancestors, like Australopithecus and Homo habilis, likely used group defence to protect against predators. They would have worked together to scare off larger predators, such as lions or crocodiles, using sticks, stones, and other tools to fight back. The act of working as a unified force against predators strengthened the social bonds of the group and laid the foundation for future forms of cooperation. Moreover, social cooperation extended beyond mere survival. It began to include shared knowledge and the transmission of skills from one generation to the next. Tool-making skills, for instance, were learned through imitation, with older members teaching younger individuals how to craft tools from stone or bone. Health knowledge, such as the use of medicinal plants, was passed down, ensuring that the group could heal injuries and illnesses. This sharing of knowledge became essential for survival and contributed to the rise of culture within human societies. One of the most significant environmental pressures that early hominids faced was the search for food. As the world transitioned from forest to savanna, food sources became more dispersed, and competition with other species for resources intensified. Early hominids were forced to evolve new methods of gathering food, including hunting, foraging, and even scavenging. The discovery of hunting as a strategy for survival was a crucial step in the evolution of humans. Initially, early hominids likely scavenged for meat, taking advantage of carcasses left behind by predators. But over time, they began to develop their own hunting strategies, using tools to kill small animals or drive larger prey into traps. This transition from scavenging to hunting marked the beginning of a new way of life for early humans. Along with hunting, early hominids adapted by developing new foraging techniques. Tool use became even more important as these early humans began to dig for underground food sources like roots and tubers, which were harder to access but provided important nutrition. The development of stone tools allowed them to break open nuts, crack bones for marrow, and even defend themselves against predators. This evolution of food-gathering techniques was a major factor in the survival of early humans, enabling them to thrive in an environment that was constantly changing. As the environment continued to challenge early humans, new evolutionary steps were necessary to survive. Homo erectus, which emerged around 1 million years ago, was the first hominid to master the use of fire. The discovery of fire was a groundbreaking achievement, as it not only provided warmth and protection from predators, but also revolutionized the way early humans obtained food. The ability to cook food made it more digestible and nutritious, allowing humans to spend less time chewing and digesting, and more time focusing on other tasks, such as hunting or tool making. In addition to the practical advantages of fire, it also provided social cohesion. Early humans gathered around fires, sharing food and stories, which likely led to the development of language and more complex social structures. Fire was a symbol of survival, a technology that marked a clear distinction between early humans and their animal ancestors. The survival of early humans was not just about physical traits, it was about adaptation. From the development of bipedalism to the invention of tools, early humans demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to adapt to changing environments. This adaptability would become one of the hallmarks of human success. The struggles faced by early humans in harsh environments, whether through shifting climates, new predators, or scarce resources, were the catalysts for the many adaptations that eventually led to the rise of Homo sapiens. The ability to adapt to a wide range of environments, from the savannas of Africa to the cold of Europe, is what ultimately allowed humanity to dominate the planet. Around 2 million years ago, a pivotal shift in human evolution took place on the southern tip of Africa. The Sediba, a species that was a hybrid between early Australopithecus and early Homo species, emerged during a critical time in the evolutionary timeline. These hominids, specifically Australopithecus sediba, offer a glimpse into the transitional period between the Australopithecus species and the Homo genus, offering crucial insight into what it was like to live on the cusp of becoming fully human. The climate of the planet was undergoing dramatic changes. Africa was transitioning from lush forests to more arid savannas, and the once dominant forests where early hominids thrived began to shrink. The world was changing rapidly, and Sediba would be one of the final pieces in the puzzle that would help shape modern humans. These creatures lived in a world full of new challenges, including competition for resources and the ever-present need to adapt to harsher conditions. But what set Sediba apart from its predecessors was its remarkable blend of old and new traits, bridging the gap between the past and the future of human evolution. At first glance, Sediba might have appeared to be an Australopithecus, a species already adapted to the tree-dwelling lifestyle. However, its skeletal structure reveals key features that mark a clear step toward the Homo genus. It was an ancient hominid that exhibited a mixture of characteristics, some found in the more primitive Australopithecus, and others that pointed forward toward the Homo lineage. Sediba possessed a small, relatively ape-like brain, yet it had a body structure that was already adapted for a more bipedal lifestyle. This was no longer just about climbing trees. Sediba had already made the transition to walking more efficiently on the ground, a trait that would be carried forward by later species like Homo habilis and Homo erectus. While it did not yet have the highly developed brain of Homo habilis, its limbs, hands and feet showed signs that Sediba was evolving towards a more human-like body shape. Its pelvis and lower limbs were more upright than that of earlier hominids, signalling that the evolutionary path was leading toward full bipedalism and ground-based living. What made Sediba particularly fascinating was that it lived during a time of rapid climatic change and intense competition for resources. The forests were disappearing, and the open savanna presented new challenges. As the climate cooled and ecosystems shifted, early hominids like Sediba had to adapt. Their diet was changing, as was their relationship with the environment. They needed to adjust their behavior, movement, and survival strategies. With the introduction of new food sources such as tubers, roots, and meat, Sediba would likely have relied on tools to gather food, similar to earlier Australopithecus species. The physical features of Sediba reveal how close these early hominids were to the eventual emergence of Homo sapiens. Sediba had a small brain, typical of the Australopithecus species, but it had already developed some Homo-like features. Its hands were adapted for tool use, though not as advanced as later hominids. The hands had longer thumbs, allowing for more precise grip, a precursor to the fine motor skills seen in modern humans. The feet, while still adapted for walking and climbing, were also showing signs of evolution toward walking upright with greater efficiency. One of the defining features of Sediba was its pelvis. The structure of its pelvis showed that Sediba was capable of walking long distances on the ground, a trait that would later be refined in Homo habilis and beyond. However, the pelvis still retained some features from its tree-dwelling ancestors, which suggests that Sediba likely spent some time in the trees as well. This combination of ground-based movement and tree-climbing abilities reflects a transitional period in the evolution of hominids, where the species was still holding on to traits that were useful in the trees, but was increasingly adapting to life on the ground. The skull of Sediba showed both primitive and advanced features. The jaw was similar to that of earlier hominids, indicating that it had a diet that was mostly plant-based, but the teeth were slightly smaller and more specialized than those of its predecessors. The face was smaller and more human-like than that of earlier Australopithecines, though it still had some ape-like characteristics. Sediba's brain, though small by modern human standards, showed signs of increased complexity in the structure of the skull and the organization of brain regions. Sediba, like other early hominids, lived in small groups that depended on cooperation for survival. These groups would have used social structures similar to those of earlier hominids, where group members worked together to find food, care for young, and protect each other from predators. However, Sediba was likely moving toward a more complex form of social cooperation, which would be crucial for the survival of its species. Sediba's group behavior likely revolved around sharing resources, protecting the vulnerable members of the group, such as infants and elderly, and collaborating in hunting and foraging. It is possible that they lived in territories that they defended from other groups, though they may not have been as organized as later hominids. Sediba would have relied on social bonds to navigate the challenges of survival, just as modern humans rely on cooperative efforts to thrive. The environment in which Sediba lived was rapidly changing. As Africa's climate became more arid, early hominids had to adapt to a world that was shifting from dense forests to more open grasslands and savannas. The introduction of grasslands meant that early hominids had to travel farther for food and water, which required greater endurance and efficiency. This is where Sediba's bipedalism came in handy. Walking on 2 feet allowed them to cover greater distances in search of resources, giving them a competitive edge over other species. While Sediba still relied heavily on its plant-based diet, the ability to use tools to gather food and hunt small animals likely played a role in its survival. Early hominids were omnivores, and Sediba probably adapted to the changing climate by diversifying its diet, scavenging for meat and using tools to extract nutrients from a variety of food sources. The development of stone tools for cutting and scraping would have helped Sediba gather food more efficiently, increasing its chances of survival in the increasingly competitive environment. While Sediba may not have been the direct ancestor of modern humans, it represents an essential link in the chain of human evolution. Its morphological features, such as its bipedalism, tool use, and adaptation to the environment laid the groundwork for the later Homo species. Sediba's transitional nature, combining both primitive and advanced traits, allowed it to navigate the changing landscape of Africa and set the stage for the emergence of Homo habilis, Homo erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens. The evolution from Australopithecus to Homo was not a simple linear process. It involved a series of adaptations, innovations, and gradual changes that were influenced by the environment, social structures, and the ability to use tools. Sediba stands as a testament to the complex and often gradual nature of human evolution. It was the final link in the chain of Australopithecus species that paved the way for the more advanced species of Homo. The species Sediba represents a significant milestone in the evolutionary timeline. It was a species in transition, a bridge between the ancient Australopithecines and the rising Homo genus. It embodied both the past and the future of human evolution. The physical traits of Sediba, its social behavior, and its adaptability to changing environments contributed to the development of the modern human lineage. Although Sediba was not the direct ancestor of Homo sapiens, its place in the evolutionary story is undeniably crucial. As one of the last of the Australopithecines, Sediba helped to lay the foundation for the extraordinary advances that would come in the next phases of human evolution. The dawn of Homo erectus marks one of the most pivotal points in human evolution. Around 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus emerged as a species that not only exemplified the culmination of earlier hominid adaptations, but also introduced groundbreaking innovations that would propel humanity forward. With larger brains, more advanced tools, and the ability to adapt to a wide range of environments, Homo erectus laid the groundwork for the global expansion of human beings. It was a species not bound to a single habitat, but capable of migrating across vast distances, overcoming obstacles, and thriving in diverse ecosystems. Homo erectus was the first hominid species to leave Africa. This expansion was not just an accident of migration, but a calculated adaptation to environmental challenges. Their ability to survive in a variety of climates, from the warmth of Africa to the Ice Age cold of Europe, demonstrates their remarkable versatility and resilience. The first true migrants of the human race, Homo erectus proved that survival was not just about enduring, but about adapting, innovating, and overcoming. Homo erectus displayed several key advancements that set them apart from their ancestors, particularly Homo habilis and earlier species. One of the most notable characteristics of Homo erectus was the size of their brain. The average brain size of Homo erectus ranged between 600 to 100 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than that of earlier hominids like Australopithecus or Homo habilis. This larger brain allowed for more complex behaviors and cognitive abilities, paving the way for innovations in tool-making, social organization, and survival strategies. Physically, Homo erectus had a more modern body shape. The legs were long and strong, adapted for efficient long-distance walking and running. This physical build suggests that Homo erectus was not just a scavenger, but also an active predator. They were able to cover long distances in search of food, a crucial advantage when living in environments that required constant movement. The shortened arms in comparison to earlier hominids further emphasize the adaptation to bipedalism, walking on 2 feet as their primary mode of locomotion. The anatomical features of Homo erectus indicate a species that was highly efficient in terms of energy expenditure. The highly efficient bipedalism and long legs enabled Homo erectus to run and walk for extended periods without exhausting themselves. This gave them a crucial edge in hunting large game and surviving in harsh environments. Moreover, the facial structure of Homo erectus also showed significant changes. They had smaller faces and teeth compared to earlier species, likely reflecting a dietary shift. The changes in the facial and jaw structure suggested a reduced reliance on heavy chewing, as Homo erectus began to consume a more diverse range of food, including meat. The decrease in tooth size was accompanied by the development of tools that helped them process food more efficiently. One of the most defining features of Homo erectus was their mastery of tools. They did not merely use tools, they created them with great skill. Homo erectus is credited with advancing the Acheulean tool culture, marked by the production of hand axes and cleavers. These tools were more sophisticated than those created by Homo habilis and earlier species, reflecting an understanding of function and form that was essential for survival in increasingly complex environments. The ability to craft tools meant that Homo erectus could access food that was previously out of reach, both through more effective hunting and by processing tough plant materials. With the tools, they could butcher larger animals, crack open bones to access marrow, and cut through fibrous plant materials that required sharper edges. Perhaps even more revolutionary was Homo erectus's discovery and control of fire. Although earlier hominids may have encountered fire from natural sources like lightning strikes, Homo erectus was the first to use fire intentionally. The ability to control fire opened up new possibilities. Fire provided warmth, protection from predators, and a means to cook food, making it easier to digest and more nutritious. Cooking also allowed Homo erectus to reduce the energy required for chewing and digestion, freeing up more energy for the brain. This innovation had profound implications for the future of the species, as it allowed Homo erectus to access a wider range of food sources, such as meat, which was previously difficult to digest without cooking. The use of fire also played a significant role in socialization. Early human groups likely gathered around the fire, which not only provided warmth and protection, but also became a place for social interactions. This would have been the starting point for the development of language and culture, as groups began to engage in conversations, share stories, and bond over communal meals. One of the most remarkable feats of Homo erectus was their ability to migrate out of Africa, marking the beginning of human expansion across the globe. Homo erectus is thought to have been the first hominid species to leave the African continent, eventually spreading to Asia and Europe. This migration is thought to have occurred in multiple waves, and Homo erectus reached places as far as China and Indonesia. The migration of Homo erectus was not simply driven by curiosity or the search for new lands. Rather, it was motivated by a desire to survive. The environmental changes that were occurring in Africa, as well as the increasingly competitive pressures from other species, likely forced Homo erectus to move into new territories in search of food, shelter, and more favourable climates. This migration was made possible by their ability to adapt to new environments and their development of tools that help them thrive in different ecosystems. Homo erectus was capable of surviving in both cold and hot climates, something their predecessors could not do. This adaptation to diverse climates demonstrated their versatility and their ability to innovate in the face of environmental challenges. The use of clothing and shelter along with fire allowed Homo erectus to endure the colder climates they encountered as they expanded into Europe and northern Asia. As Homo erectus spread across the globe, they developed increasingly complex social structures. Although they were not as socially complex as Homo sapiens, Homo erectus exhibited group cooperation that was essential for survival in harsh environments. They likely lived in small groups that hunted and foraged together, sharing resources and responsibilities. The strong sense of social bonds within groups would have been a key element in the survival of the species. While Homo erectus did not have the sophisticated language of modern humans, their ability to communicate and work together in complex tasks suggests a rudimentary form of communication. The coordination required for group hunting, tool-making and survival suggests that Homo erectus had a basic linguistic and symbolic system that allowed them to cooperate effectively. Their tool-making and fire control also played a significant role in socialization. These skills were shared within the group and passed down through generations. As Homo erectus adapted to new environments, their cultural and technological advancements allowed them to outcompete other species and establish themselves as one of the most successful hominids of their time. The legacy of Homo erectus is profound. While they were not the direct ancestors of Homo sapiens, their innovations in tool-making, fire control and social cooperation laid the groundwork for the future development of Homo sapiens. Homo erectus demonstrated the importance of migration, adaptation and innovation, and these qualities were passed down to their descendants. As Homo erectus continued to thrive across multiple continents, they created the cultural and technological foundation upon which modern humanity would be built. The Homo erectus journey from Africa to Asia and Europe marked the first true global expansion of our species. Their journey not only shaped the future of human evolution, but also exemplified the resilience and adaptability that would characterize humanity for centuries to come. Around 300,000 years ago, a new species emerged that would forever alter the trajectory of life on Earth. Homo sapiens, or modern humans, began their evolutionary journey, initially appearing in Africa and eventually spreading across the globe. This species, with its unparalleled cognitive abilities, complex social structures, and remarkable capacity for innovation, would go on to dominate the planet. The emergence of Homo sapiens marked the culmination of millions of years of evolutionary change, during which earlier hominids like Homo erectus and Homo habilis laid the foundations for what would become the most advanced species to ever walk the Earth. But it was Homo sapiens' unique cognitive abilities, advanced tool use, and ability to adapt to virtually every environment that would eventually allow them to thrive across the planet. They were no longer confined to the savannas of Africa or limited by the physical traits of their ancestors. They became a species capable of shaping their surroundings, creating complex societies, and crafting a future unimaginable to those who came before them. The first and perhaps most profound change that distinguished Homo sapiens from earlier hominids was their cognitive abilities. While earlier species such as Homo erectus had exhibited impressive intelligence, Homo sapiens had an advanced ability for abstract thinking and symbolic reasoning. This cognitive revolution allowed humans to engage in complex problem-solving, plan for the future, and understand their place in the world. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this cognitive leap was the development of language. The ability to communicate using complex symbols, whether through spoken words or later through written language, transformed the way Homo sapiens interacted with each other and with the world. Early humans could now share ideas, collaborate on tasks, and pass down knowledge across generations, something no other species could do with the same degree of precision and complexity. This language allowed Homo sapiens to express emotions, recount history, and tell stories, an ability that would lay the foundation for culture, religion, and social organization. Early humans began to develop art, rituals, and spiritual beliefs, marking the start of a symbolic culture that would continue to evolve for millennia. This ability to think abstractly and create meaning through symbols is one of the key characteristics that sets humans apart from all other species. With symbolic thinking came the ability to imagine possibilities, to think about things that were not immediately present and plan for the future. This capacity for future planning and goal setting set Homo sapiens apart from their predecessors and laid the foundation for technological advancements, complex social systems, and the eventual rise of civilizations. As Homo sapiens began to evolve, they demonstrated unparalleled mastery over their environment. Unlike their predecessors, who relied on basic tools for survival, Homo sapiens innovated in ways that were previously unimaginable. Early Homo sapiens crafted advanced stone tools, but they also began to experiment with new materials, including bone, wood, and later, metals. The development of tools was no longer limited to the simple hand axes and spears used by earlier hominids. Homo sapiens invented spear throwers, bows and arrows, and fishing hooks, giving them the ability to hunt more efficiently and gather food more effectively. These tools were used not only for survival, but also for the creation of art and the construction of shelters. The ability to craft and use more sophisticated tools was directly tied to Homo sapiens' increased brain capacity. The more complex the tools became, the greater the need for problem-solving, planning, and social cooperation. Early humans began to live in larger groups, collaborating on tasks and developing shared knowledge to ensure the survival of the community. This ability to work together and innovate in response to changing environmental conditions was a key factor in their success. Perhaps the most important technological leap came with the control of fire. Homo sapiens perfected the use of fire, not only for cooking food, but also for warmth, protection, and socialization. Fire allowed them to cook meat, making it more digestible and providing essential nutrients. It also provided warmth and light in the dark, cold nights of the Ice Age, and allowed early humans to venture into more extreme environments. The rise of Homo sapiens also brought about a transformation in social structures. Unlike earlier species that lived in smaller, more fragmented groups, Homo sapiens began to form complex societies with more defined roles and hierarchies. This social complexity allowed for greater cooperation as humans learned to divide labor, share resources, and work together toward common goals. Early human societies likely revolved around family groups, but as Homo sapiens spread across the globe, they began to form larger, more cohesive communities. These communities were not just about survival, but about creating a sense of identity and belonging. As language, art, and ritual became more central to human life, early humans began to create culture, passing down traditions, stories, and beliefs from generation to generation. Social cooperation became a key element of survival. Early humans were able to achieve more through collaboration than through individual effort alone. They developed complex methods of hunting and gathering, dividing tasks and working together to ensure that everyone had enough to eat. Homo sapiens also began to domesticate animals and cultivate crops, leading to the development of agriculture, which would ultimately give rise to permanent settlements and the birth of civilization. The migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa was another defining moment in the story of our species. Unlike their predecessors, who had remained largely confined to Africa, Homo sapiens began to spread across the globe, adapting to a wide range of environments. They crossed into Europe, Asia, and eventually the Americas, navigating harsh climates, varied ecosystems, and geographic barriers. This migration was made possible by Homo sapiens' ability to innovate and adapt. Their mastery of tools, ability to use fire, and social cooperation allowed them to survive in environments that were previously inhospitable. As they moved into new regions, early humans encountered new challenges: cold climates, new predators, and unfamiliar ecosystems. But Homo sapiens were resilient, using their technological innovations and social structures to conquer these challenges. One of the most remarkable aspects of Homo sapiens was their ability to create culture. Early humans began to express themselves through art, creating cave paintings, carvings, and sculptures. These early forms of art not only represented the world around them, but also served as a way to express emotions, beliefs, and spirituality. Early humans likely used art to communicate with one another, to tell stories, and to explain the mysteries of the world. Religion and belief systems began to develop as well. The awareness of death, the passage of time, and the forces of nature likely led to the creation of spiritual beliefs and rituals. Early humans began to worship deities, perform burial rituals, and celebrate seasonal changes. These religious practices helped to bind communities together and gave people a sense of meaning and purpose in a world filled with uncertainty. The development of rituals, beliefs, and symbolism was a crucial aspect of human evolution. It allowed Homo sapiens to transcend their immediate environment and think beyond the here and now. The ability to reflect on the past, imagine the future, and create meaning through symbols was a key factor that set Homo sapiens apart from all other species. The emergence of Homo sapiens marked the beginning of a new era in the history of life on Earth. With their advanced cognitive abilities, social structures, and ability to innovate and adapt, early humans created a world that was far beyond what any other species could have imagined. They conquered new lands, created complex societies, and left behind a legacy of culture, technology, and progress that would continue to evolve for millennia. The story of Homo sapiens is one of resilience, adaptation, and innovation. From the first emergence of early humans in Africa to their spread across the globe, Homo sapiens have demonstrated an unparalleled ability to survive, thrive, and shape the world around them. They have invented tools, discovered fire, and developed languages, art, and culture. But perhaps the most important legacy of Homo sapiens is their ability to cooperate and work together as a species, using their collective intelligence to overcome challenges and shape a future of endless possibilities. As we look back at the journey of Homo sapiens, we see not only the story of a single species, but the history of life itself. The triumphs and struggles of our ancestors are woven into the very fabric of who we are, and their legacy continues to shape the future of humanity. The story of Homo sapiens is a testament to the power of adaptation, the resilience of the human spirit, and the incredible potential for progress that lies within us all. The story of Homo sapiens is one of migration, expansion, and the relentless pursuit of new frontiers. From their origins in Africa, modern humans began a journey that would take them across the globe, overcoming challenges that no other species before them had faced. This final chapter in the evolutionary tale of Homo sapiens chronicles the migration that would ultimately make humans the most widespread and adaptable species on Earth. Their journey is not only about geography, but also about the development of societies, technology, and culture that would define human civilization as we know it. As Homo sapiens evolved, they developed the physical traits, tools, and social structures that enabled them to leave the African continent and spread into new environments. The reasons for this migration were many: climatic changes, overpopulation in certain regions, and the constant drive to search for food, water, and new territory. Whatever the initial reason, Homo sapiens began to venture far beyond their original habitat. With their advanced tools, mastery of fire, and complex social structures, they were no longer confined to the warm savannas and forests of Africa. They were capable of adapting to a range of environments, from the icy tundras of Europe to the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia. The migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa is a defining moment in the history of our species. The out of Africa theory posits that Homo sapiens first emerged in Africa approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, before migrating to other parts of the world. Evidence suggests that Homo sapiens first left Africa in several waves, beginning as early as 100,000 years ago, though it is still debated whether there was a single migration or multiple waves over thousands of years. This migration was not a single event but a gradual process. Homo sapiens likely followed the land bridges and coastal routes that connected Africa to the rest of the world. As the Ice Age began to shape the landscape, glaciation created narrow land corridors where human populations could travel, particularly in the Middle East and Central Asia. These passages enabled early humans to move into parts of Europe, Asia, and eventually Australia and the Americas. The spread of Homo sapiens was not a simple matter of travelling across open land. These early humans were met with challenges at every step: harsh climates, unfamiliar ecosystems, and competition with other species, including other hominids like Neanderthals and Denisovans. These challenges, however, also fueled their resilience and adaptability. Over time, Homo sapiens spread across every corner of the Earth, adapting to diverse environments, from the icy landscapes of the Arctic to the humid forests of the Amazon. As Homo sapiens migrated into Europe and Asia, they encountered new challenges and new species. The most notable encounter was with the Neanderthals, a close cousin of Homo sapiens. Neanderthals had lived in Europe for thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived. They were well adapted to the cold climates of Ice Age Europe, with their robust bodies and large brains, which were thought to help them survive the harsh conditions. However, despite their physical advantages, Neanderthals ultimately went extinct. The reasons for their disappearance are still debated, but some of the key factors include competition with Homo sapiens, climate changes, and possibly interbreeding. Genetic evidence shows that while Neanderthals did not survive, they contributed to the modern human gene pool. Modern humans of non-African descent have between 1% to 2% of Neanderthal DNA, a legacy of their interactions during the migration and eventual integration of these two species. Similarly, Homo sapiens encountered another group of ancient humans in Asia, the Denisovans. These humans, named after the Denisova cave in Siberia, were genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans. Though little is known about their physical appearance, DNA analysis has shown that Homo sapiens interbred with Denisovans, leaving traces of their genetic material in some modern populations, particularly in Melanesians, Australian Aboriginals and East Asians. The genetic evidence suggests that, like the Neanderthals, the Denisovans and Homo sapiens shared a complex history of coexistence and genetic exchange. As Homo sapiens spread across the globe, their interactions with these other species were likely complex. These encounters were not limited to conflict or competition. They may have involved cultural exchange, interbreeding, and collaboration in ways that are still not fully understood. The legacy of these ancient humans is embedded in our genomes, and their presence in the past reminds us that humanity has always been shaped by interactions, migrations, and a constant blending of cultures. After spreading across Africa, Europe, and Asia, Homo sapiens continued their journey to other parts of the world, most notably Australia and the Americas. The migration into Australia occurred around 65,000 years ago, likely via land bridges and sea routes during a period of lower sea levels. Early humans reached Australia and adapted to the diverse environments from the tropical rainforest to the arid deserts. The migration into the Americas is a more recent phenomenon, with evidence suggesting that humans entered the continent at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. It is believed that early humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge during a period when it connected Siberia to Alaska. From there, they spread southward, eventually populating the entire continent. This migration was part of the larger global expansion that saw Homo sapiens colonize virtually every landmass on the planet. The migration to these remote and challenging regions tested the ingenuity and resilience of early humans. Whether it was crossing vast oceans or adapting to new ecosystems, Homo sapiens demonstrated an incredible capacity to innovate and adapt, two traits that would be essential for survival as the species expanded into new territories. The spread of Homo sapiens across the globe was made possible not just by their physical adaptations, but by their technological advancements. As they moved into new territories, they adapted their tools to fit the environments they encountered. In Europe, for example, Homo sapiens developed sophisticated hunting tools for large game, such as spear points, harpoons, and bows and arrows. In colder climates, they developed clothing made from animal skins and created shelters that could protect them from the elements. The development of fire remained a crucial element in the survival of Homo sapiens as they migrated. Fire was not only essential for warmth and cooking, but also for hunting and protection. Early humans used fire to clear land, drive animals into traps, and ward off predators. The control of fire helped Homo sapiens adapt to even the harshest environments, such as the Arctic tundra. Homo sapiens also developed early forms of agriculture as they settled into new regions. The shift from hunting and gathering to farming was a slow process, but allowed early human societies to establish permanent settlements and thrive in environments that had previously been inhospitable. This ability to cultivate plants, raise livestock, and create stable food sources would ultimately lead to the rise of civilizations and the advent of modern society. The migration of Homo sapiens across the globe was not just about survival, it was also about the development of culture and social structures. As early humans adapted to new environments, they also developed new forms of social organization. The advent of art, language, religion, and rituals created a sense of shared identity and culture. By 10,000 BCE, Homo sapiens had established complex social structures, built cities, and developed systems of trade, government, and communication. The interactions between different groups of Homo sapiens across the globe led to the formation of the first civilizations, from Mesopotamia and Egypt to the Indus Valley and China. The migration of early humans was not just a physical journey, but also an intellectual and cultural revolution that would continue to shape human history for millennia. The migration of Homo sapiens across the globe is one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. It showcases not only the physical resilience of our species, but also our cognitive abilities, technological innovations, and social cooperation. From the first steps out of Africa to the settlement of the Americas and beyond, Homo sapiens demonstrated an unparalleled ability to adapt to new environments, overcome challenges, and create meaningful connections with one another. This journey, which began over 300,000 years ago, is far from over. The ability of Homo sapiens to spread across the globe and thrive in every environment remains a testament to our innate curiosity, resilience, and capacity for innovation. As we continue to explore new frontiers, whether through space exploration or new technologies, we carry with us the legacy of our ancient migrations an enduring reminder that humanity's journey is one of both survival and unlimited potential.